Welcome back, everyone, to Rambling Dan Rose Deep Dive Book Reviews. We're glad to have you with us. Today, we're diving into a book that you guys wanted us to explore. It's called How to Win an Information War, The Propagandist Who Outwitted Hitler. And it's by Peter Pomerantsev.
Oh, yeah. This one's a fascinating read. It's a deep dive into the world of information warfare, but through this really unique historical lens. The book basically revolves around this guy, Sefton Delmer. He was a British propagandist during World War II, and he used some pretty unconventional tactics to fight against Nazi Germany. Some pretty interesting stuff.
Now, before we get too far into the book itself, it might be good to give a little background on Pomerantsev himself. He's an author and a journalist who's really made a name for himself looking at propaganda and disinformation, especially in the modern world. He's written quite a bit about Russia and their information strategies.
Yeah, I think his own background really informs this book. He actually grew up in the Soviet Union. So he's seen firsthand how these things play out, and you can definitely see those connections he's making between what Delmer was doing back in World War II and the techniques that we're seeing used today in modern information warfare.
So the book kicks off with Chapter 1. Propaganda is the remedy for loneliness. And it kind of sets the stage.
Yeah.
Early 20th century Germany. Young Sefton Delmer is witnessing the rise of propaganda firsthand.
This chapter is so important, for really understanding Delmer and what shaped his outlook on the world. It explores his upbringing, growing up in Germany at a time when the country was really divided, and it was going through this huge process of unification. And, Pomerantsev makes it clear that national newspapers, emerging technology, and of course war propaganda played a huge role in that whole process.
There's this one story in this chapter that I thought was so striking. Young Delmer desperately wants to display the German flag in his window, right alongside all the other houses on his street. But his family is British, so they're considered the enemy at the time.
Yeah, I remember that part. Such a powerful anecdote, right? Because it really gets at that fundamental human need to belong, to fit in, to be part of something bigger than yourself. And it shows how propaganda can really exploit that need. It can override our logic, especially in times of uncertainty and fear.
And speaking of that need to belong, Pomerantsev brings in this French philosopher, Jacques Ellul, who wrote a lot about propaganda.
Yeah.
Ellul basically argued that propaganda is like a remedy for loneliness, offering people a sense of purpose and connection in a world that can often feel pretty isolating and chaotic.
And that idea that propaganda can be a tool for social cohesion and control, I mean, that's central to Delmer's approach to his work. He really understood the psychology of it all. He knew how to kind of tap into those needs and desires to influence people's beliefs and behavior.
So moving on to Chapter 2, The Nazi Circus. We see Delmer return to Germany in the 1920s, this time as a journalist, covering the world of Weimar Berlin, which was, as Pomerantsev describes it, incredibly vibrant and chaotic.
Oh man, Weimar Berlin, what a time and a place. This was a city of extremes. It was like a melting pot of political ideologies, artistic experimentation, social upheaval. Pomerantsev really paints a picture of this, especially the cabaret culture of that time. Social identities were so fluid. Reinvention was celebrated. It was like a complete contrast to the rigid order of pre-war Germany.
And during all this, Delmer becomes fascinated by the Nazis. And that fascination kind of leads him into some pretty unusual situations. He actually ends up attending a private Nazi meeting, posing as an assistant to Ernst Röhm, who was the leader of the SA, or the stormtroopers.
That's incredible. I mean, talk about audacity, right? And the craziest part is Röhm actually thought that Delmer was a British spy, which ended up giving Delmer this unexpected glimpse into the Nazi inner circle. He got to see their private behavior, the things they didn't want the public to see. And it's through these encounters that Delmer starts to realize there's this huge gap between the Nazis' carefully crafted public image and the brutal reality of what they were actually doing.
The book then goes into Delmer's observations of Hitler's propaganda tactics, especially during the 1932 election tour. Pomerantsev highlights this event, the flight over Germany, and describes it as this carefully staged spectacle designed to project power, modernity, and this sense of overwhelming support.
The use of air travel back then was still relatively new, and so this image of Hitler descending from the sky like a godlike figure, it was incredibly powerful. It really reinforced that idea of him as this leader who was both modern and connected to the people.
And then Pomerantsev introduces us to this concept of sociological propaganda, which was actually a term coined by Joseph Goebbels, who was the Nazi minister of propaganda. And sociological propaganda, it goes beyond just spreading a message. It's really about shaping people's beliefs and behaviors over time by creating this shared reality, a narrative that people just accept without question.
It's about creating a myth, And Goebbels and the Nazis, they were masters at this. You know, the myth of the Aryan race, the myth of Germany's inevitable victory. They used these myths to evoke these strong emotions, to instill this sense of national pride, and ultimately to justify their actions, even the most horrific ones.
And it's unsettling to see how these tactics are still being used today, often with devastating consequences.
Absolutely. Think about the century of humiliation narrative that's used in China and Russia. These narratives, they draw on historical grievances, some imagined, to fuel nationalism, justify aggression, silence dissent. They play on people's sense of injustice, their desire for revenge, their yearning for a return to past glory.
And they're so effective because they tap into these deep-seated emotional needs. They kind of bypass rational thought and critical analysis, which is what makes them so dangerous.
Right, exactly. So we move on to chapter 3, Not Reliable. And here the book really starts to dig into Delmer's complex relationship with the Nazi Party. He kept attending their gatherings, observing their private behavior. There's even this part where he's playing Nazi marches on the piano for their entertainment. It really starts to raise questions about Delmer's own motivations.
Yeah.
You know, and the ethical lines he was willing to cross.
Yeah, there's one anecdote that I found particularly intriguing. A British ambassador reported that Delmer had actually advised a preemptive war against Hitler, which, I mean, it just adds another layer of intrigue to his character. It makes you wonder how all of his work was driven by a genuine desire to stop the Nazis, and how much of it was maybe fueled by this fascination with power and manipulation.
It's a great question. And you know, Pomerantsev doesn't shy away from the moral ambiguities. He doesn't try to present Delmer as a simple hero or villain. Instead, he portrays him as this complex and flawed individual, someone who is both repelled by and drawn to the dark forces he was witnessing.
Even Delmer's marriage to Isabel, an artist living in Paris, is presented as this strategic move to facilitate his work. It makes you question, you know, how much his personal life was intertwined with his professional ambitions.
Yeah.
And whether there was even a genuine emotional connection there.
Yeah, it's really hard to tell sometimes what his true motivations were. He was a master at playing the game. And Pomerantsev does a great job of keeping that tension alive throughout the book.
And then we get to chapter 4, All Doubts Fall Away. And this is really a turning point in the book. The outbreak of World War II happens, and Delmer's role shifts from observer to active participant. In the information war,
this is where Delmer's deep understanding of German culture and psychology really shines. He's not just a journalist anymore. He's a weapon in the British government's arsenal, tasked with undermining the Nazi war machine from within.
And it's interesting, the British government initially tries to counter Nazi propaganda, appealing to reason and evidence. But as we see, that's not very effective.
Yeah, it's a common mistake to think that just presenting facts is going to change people's minds, especially when they're caught up in a really powerful narrative. Delmer understood that propaganda operates on a much deeper level. It taps into those primal instincts, the fears and desires.
This is where the work of Victor Klemperer comes in. He was a German Jewish diarist who documented the language and propaganda of the Nazi regime. And his observations give us this really chilling insight into how the Nazis used language to shape people's thoughts and behaviors.
One of the most striking examples is the word Untermenschen, which means subhuman. The Nazis used this term to dehumanize entire groups of people, stripping them of their dignity and justifying their persecution. It's a stark reminder of how language can be used as a weapon to incite hatred and violence.
And it's frighteningly relevant to the way language is used in modern conflicts, where enemies are often demonized and dehumanized to justify aggression.
Exactly. Think about how certain groups are labeled as terrorists or extremists. These labels, they strip away their humanity, making it easier to justify violence against them.
Pomerantsev also connects this to Hannah Arendt's concept of totalitarian mass leaders. Arendt argued that these leaders thrive by creating a culture of fear and conformity, where individuals are encouraged to relinquish responsibility and just blindly follow the dictates of the state.
And it's so seductive because it offers the sense of belonging and purpose, but at the same time, it absolves individuals of any guilt or responsibility for their actions, like Arndt said. In totalitarian regimes, people often participate in atrocities, not out of malice, but out of this misguided sense of duty and obedience.
And then we get to chapter 5, Into the Ridiculous, which introduces us to Delmer's most audacious project, a black radio station operating out of Woburn Abbey, this grand estate north of London.
This chapter really captures that cloak and dagger atmosphere. of wartime propaganda. You have this historic estate steeped in tradition and aristocracy being used as a secret base for psychological warfare. It's such a striking juxtaposition.
And it's at Woburn Abbey that Delmer creates his most infamous character, de Chef, this fictional, foul-mouthed Prussian officer who becomes a mouthpiece for Delmer's subversive messages.
Oh yeah, dear chef. What a brilliant creation. This caricature of the Nazi elite, exposing their hypocrisy and corruption through humor and satire, and even some pretty shocking content, like he was this twisted mirror, reflecting back the absurdity of the Nazi regime.
The book gives some pretty outrageous examples of der Chef's broadcast, like descriptions of lavish SS orgies and rampant corruption within the Nazi Party. It was shocking, even obscene at times, but it was also incredibly effective.
Delmer understood that sometimes you have to fight fire with fire. He couldn't just appeal to reason or present dry facts. He had to tap into people's emotions, their baser instincts, even their sense of humor. He had to make them laugh, make them think, and ultimately make them question the authority of the regime.
And it wasn't just about spreading rumors or undermining morale. Delmer's broadcasts were designed to influence specific actions.
Right, and that's where we get to Chapter 6, that beastly pornographic organization. Here we see how Delmer's focus shifts from just challenging beliefs to encouraging specific behaviors that would disrupt the Nazi war effort.
One of the most striking examples is the Illness Saves Manual, designed to encourage German soldiers to feign illness, to avoid combat.
Yeah, the manual was full of practical tips and tricks for faking symptoms, inducing fevers, mimicking nervous breakdowns. It was controversial, for sure. But it also showed just how well Delmer understood the psychology of warfare. He knew that survival instincts are powerful, and that even the most indoctrinated soldier might choose self-preservation over blind obedience.
Then in Chapter 7, Strength Through Fear, we see how Delmer tries to undermine Nazi propaganda by exposing its inherent artificiality.
This is where we see Delmer's talent for irony and satire really shine. He would take the Nazis' own slogans and pronouncements and just twist them, revealing the absurdity and contradictions within them. He understood that one of the best ways to disarm a powerful ideology is to make people laugh at it.
The fact that Jewish collaborators joined Delmer's team at Woburn Abbey further highlighted the absurdity of Nazi ideology.
It was such a powerful symbol of resistance, showing that even the people the Nazis sought to demonize were working to undermine them from within. It's a testament to the power of human resilience.
As the war progresses, and Germany's defeat becomes more and more inevitable, the tone of the book starts to shift. Chapter 8, D-Day and the Death Drive, explores the darker side of wartime propaganda, specifically the concept of the death drive, or thanatos, as Freud called it.
The death drive, in this context, refers to a kind of psychological surrender, like a willingness to embrace destruction, even self-destruction, rather than face the pain of defeat. It's a powerful force, and the Nazis were able to exploit that, especially in their final days.
Pomerantsev describes how Nazi propaganda starts to glorify self-sacrifice, painting death as this noble act of defiance against the enemy. It's a chilling perversion of the human instinct for survival.
And we see echoes of that in modern propaganda as well. Think about suicide bombers, who are indoctrinated to believe that their death will bring them glory and rewards in the afterlife. It's a horrifying example of how the death drive can be manipulated for political ends.
Delmer recognized the danger of this mentality, and he tried to counter it by appealing to the very human desire for self-preservation.
He kept promoting the Illness Saves Manual, encouraging soldiers to find ways to avoid combat, to survive the war. He understood that even in the face of overwhelming odds, there was always hope, and that even the smallest act of resistance could make a difference.
Chapter 9, Valkyrie, takes us to the aftermath of the failed assassination attempt on Hitler in July 1944. The attempt, though ultimately unsuccessful, created this brief moment of chaos and uncertainty within Germany.
And Delmer, he seized upon this opportunity to sow further discord within the Nazi ranks. He used his radio broadcast to highlight the internal divisions within the regime, pointing out that even those closest to Hitler were plotting against him.
It was a clever tactic to exploit those existing cracks in the Nazi facade.
And it reminds us that even the most tightly controlled regimes are vulnerable to internal dissent. Propaganda is most effective when it can tap into those existing anxieties, the resentments and power struggles that are already there.
As the war enters its final stages, the book really focuses on the psychological impact of Germany's impending defeat. Chapter 10, How Dead is Hitler, explores how individuals cope with the loss of hope, the disintegration of their beliefs, and the fear of what the future holds.
We see this through Victor Klemperer's diary entries, which provide this powerful glimpse into the lives of ordinary Germans. During this turbulent time, his descriptions of the Allied bombing raids on Dresden are particularly haunting, capturing the fear and despair that gripped the nation.
But even as the reality of defeat set in, Nazi propaganda continued to push this narrative of denial and escapism.
The book talks about light entertainment on the radio, upbeat films, all designed to distract people from the grim realities of war. It was a desperate attempt to maintain control, to keep people clinging to the myth of German invincibility, even as the evidence to the contrary mounted.
And Goebbels, the master propagandist, didn't give up. He combined these distractions with promises of miracle weapons and ultimate victory, playing on people's desperation.
It's a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming evidence, propaganda can be incredibly seductive, especially when it offers a comforting illusion in the face of an unbearable reality.
Then we come to Chapter 11, How to Win an Information War, which transitions us to the end of the war and examines Delmer's vision for a new democratic Germany. Delmer was really convinced that the failures of the Weimar Republic, especially the way its media was manipulated by propaganda, that really contributed to the rise of Nazism. He sought a free and responsible press as just essential for a healthy democracy.
It makes sense when you think about the historical context. I mean, Delmer's vision was to create this whole media landscape in Germany that really valued truth and accuracy and responsible reporting. He wanted to break free from the sensationalism and all the partisan bias that really plagued the Weimar era.
Which was a pretty ambitious goal.
Yeah.
Especially considering, the massive task of rebuilding Germany after the war.
Oh, absolutely. It was a huge undertaking.
And there's this kind of ironic twist, right? Delmer ends up facing criticism for his own wartime methods, especially that whole black radio thing. At the same time, he's trying to build a more ethical media landscape.
Yeah, it's like this classic case of, the ends justify the means kind of thing. It makes you think about the whole legacy of Delmer's work. I mean, he was definitely brilliant, but his methods were definitely controversial. It raises all these questions about the balance between fighting for a good cause and the methods you use to achieve it.
Definitely. And then we get to Chapter 12, Ordinary. And the book kind of shifts focus away from Delmer himself and more onto the lives of those who worked alongside him at Woburn Abbey. We start to see the personal sacrifices and the emotional burdens that all these people carried, being involved in this clandestine world of propaganda.
It's really powerful. One of the stories that stuck with me was Frank Linder, the Jewish actor who actually played a Nazi officer on Delmer's radio station. And tragically, his own mother died in Auschwitz.
Oh, wow. That's heavy.
Right. It just brings home the reality of the situation. These people were fighting against this horrific regime, and they were putting themselves at risk, and some of them, suffered tremendous personal loss.
It's incredibly courageous. I mean, to keep going despite that kind of loss.
It really is. And then there's the whole story about Renee Halkett, another key member of the Woburn Abbey team. Really gifted artist and writer, but he resented being treated like a character in Delmer's narrative, He felt like his creative talents were being used, and he struggled to reconcile his role in the whole propaganda war with his own personal values.
Yeah, it really gets into the ethical dilemmas, When you're fighting an information war, where do you draw the line between using deception for what you believe is a good cause and, potentially compromising your own integrity? And those are questions that are still relevant today.
Totally. And it's worth noting, that both Linder and Halkett went on to do really important work after the war. Linder's records from Woburn Abbey actually helped track down Nazi war criminals. And Halkett, his post-war radio broadcasts, were all about promoting understanding and reconciliation between Germany and Britain.
It's amazing, really. Even after experiencing all that trauma, they still found ways to contribute to making the world a better place.
Resilience, right. The human spirit.
Exactly. And towards the end of the book, Pomerantsev makes this really interesting comparison between Delmer and the archetype of the trickster that you find in mythology and folklore.
The trickster archetype, that's fascinating.
Right. Tricksters are often these figures of chaos. They like to disrupt things, but they can also be agents of change. They shake things up, and sometimes that leads to renewal.
Like Loki in Norse mythology.
Exactly. Or the coyote in Native American folklore. They use deception and trickery to achieve their goals. But their actions can also have all these unintended consequences, some good, some bad. It's never clear-cut.
And Delmer fits that mold, operating in a world of shadows and illusions.
Exactly. A master of deception. But deep down, he really believed in the power of truth. I mean, he was a complicated guy. Flawed, for sure. But There's no denying how brilliant he was and the impact he had on this whole field of information warfare.
Absolutely. And it's also relevant today, isn't it? I mean, how do Delmer's methods and insights hold up in our modern world with all the disinformation and propaganda we see now and how trust in traditional media has just eroded?
Yeah, I mean, the parallels are pretty striking. That's one of the things that makes this book so compelling. Pomerantsev shows how strategies that Delmer used back in the 1940s are still relevant in the age of social media and fake news. We see it with all the conspiracy theories, the way social media algorithms are manipulated, the use of bots and trolls to spread misinformation. It's all so sophisticated now.
And don't forget about state actors, using these techniques to try to influence public opinion.
So what can we learn from Delmer's story? I mean, what can we do to counter these tactics and protect ourselves from manipulation?
Well, one of the key things is to be really critical of the information we are consuming, right? We have to be aware of our own biases, question our assumptions, and make sure we're getting information from a variety of sources, not just relying on our social media feeds or our favorite news channels. We have to be proactive about seeking out different perspectives and challenging our own beliefs.
It's like Delmer believed, right? Propaganda thrives when people are in the dark.
Exactly. He knew that to counter it, you have to provide accurate information, expose the lies, and make sure the voices of those who are being silenced are heard.
So how do we do that today?
Well, supporting independent journalism is huge. Fact-checking, really looking into the sources of information, supporting organizations that are fighting disinformation, and just as individuals, being willing to speak up against injustice, to challenge people when they're spreading falsehoods.
It feels like a daunting task sometimes.
It is. But Delmer's story shows us that even in the face of all of this propaganda, individual acts of resistance can make a real difference.
It's about not giving up.
Yeah.
And, how to win an information war is a call to action in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in defending truth and democracy, especially in the digital age.
It really is.
So if you're at all interested in this stuff, the history of propaganda, the tactics of information warfare, I highly recommend checking out How to Win an Information War. It's a fascinating book. It'll make you think, and you'll come away with a much deeper understanding of how information shapes our world.
Couldn't agree more. It's a really timely read.
And that's all for our deep dive into How to Win an Information War. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.